She was supposed to be nothing, a servant girl with calloused hands and a borrowed name, sweeping the floors of a pack that would have killed her on sight if they'd known the truth. On her first morning, she looked the most feared alpha in 3 territories directly in the eye and told him he was wrong. The entire hall went silent. Servants froze mid-step. Warriors reached for the hilts of blades they didn't dare draw. Everyone waited for the scream, for the punishment, for the girl to be dragged out by her hair and never seen again. Instead, Alpha King Roman Ashcroft, a man who had ended wars with a single word, who had not smiled in 4 years, who had buried a mate and sworn never to bond again, tilted his head, studied her like she was the only interesting thing in the room, and said quietly, "Say that again." She did. He didn't punish her. He watched her. For weeks, he watched her scrub floors she was born never to touch, wear rags over a bloodline older than his own throne, and hide a heart that was breaking in silence for a man who didn't deserve one piece of it. And on the night she finally stood in front of that man, her fiancé, the wolf she'd given up her name and her crown to protect, and heard him laughing with another woman in his arms, calling her the servant girl he settled for, Roman Ashcroft was already walking toward the ceremony grounds, because he had recognized her scent the moment she first spoke back to him. He just hadn't told her whose daughter she was. Stay until the end, because the moment she rejects the man she sacrificed everything for, in front of every pack leader in the North, is the moment this story stops being about heartbreak and becomes something no one in that hall will ever forget. Hi everyone, and welcome back to Rena's Romance 2, the channel where hidden queens, ruthless alpha kings, and slow burn love stories come alive. If you're new here, this is exactly the kind of story you came for. Forbidden identity, heartbreak, betrayal, and a love that rewrites the fate of an entire kingdom. Before we start, if you love werewolf romance as much as we do, hit that subscribe button right now. We post new full-length stories every week, and you will not want to miss what's coming next. Drop a comment telling us where you're listening from tonight, and if this hook already has your heart racing, smash that like button so more people can find this story. Now, let's begin. The scent of lavender soap and cold stone had become Alara Nightsong's entire world. 3 years ago, she had walked through the gates of Draven Hall carrying nothing but a cloth bag and a lie so heavy it should have crushed her. She told them her name was Alara Winters, a wandering wolf from a dead pack, seeking nothing more than a servant's wage and a roof that didn't leak. They believed her. Why wouldn't they? No one expected the lost princess of House Emberwood, heir to a crown that had been burned to ash in a single bloody night, to be scrubbing floors in the servants' wing of a rival territory, 3 ranks below the lowest warrior, invisible to everyone who mattered. That invisibility had kept her alive. It had also kept her close to Callum Draven. She could still remember the boy he used to be. 19, hungry-eyed, third in line for an alpha title he wasn't supposed to inherit, sitting beside her on the riverbank of a territory that no longer existed, promising her that one day he would build something neither of their packs could take away. She had believed him. She had loved him with the reckless, total devotion of a girl who had already lost everything else. So when her family's kingdom fell, and her brothers scattered into hiding, Alara made a choice that would define the next 3 years of her life. She would not go to Callum as a princess. A princess would make him a target. A princess would need protecting, watching, guarding, and protection drew wolves who wanted to finish what had already been started against her bloodline. So she erased herself instead. She became nobody so that he could become something. She whispered political warnings to him through anonymous notes she paid couriers to deliver. She used the last of her mother's jewels to bribe an alliance that made him a beta at 21. She swallowed insults from wolves who didn't know they were speaking to royalty, and she told herself, every single night, that it was worth it, because Callum was building a future, and one day, when it was safe, she would step out of the shadows and stand beside him as his equal. She never once let herself imagine what would happen if he stopped waiting for her. "Winters!" The voice cracked across the servants' hall like a whip. Alara straightened, arms full of linens, and turned to find Vera Sinclair storming toward her, silk skirts snapping with every furious step. Vera was Beta Draven's cousin, technically ranked above every servant in the hall, and she had made it her personal mission over the last year to remind Alara of that fact as often as possible. "These sheets smell like rose water," Vera snapped, snatching one from the pile and shoving it against Alara's face. "I asked for lilac. Are you deaf or simply useless?" Alara didn't flinch. She had learned, long ago, that flinching only fed wolves like Vera. "I'll change them," she said evenly. "You'll do more than change them." Vera's eyes glittered with something uglier than irritation, something that had been building for weeks, ever since whispers started that Callum, soon to be named Full Alpha, still hadn't set a mating date with his supposed betrothed. "You'll apologize, on your knees, in front of the other servants, so they remember what happens when someone forgets their place." The hall had gone quiet. A dozen servants stood frozen mid-task, eyes darting between the two women, none of them daring to intervene. Alara felt something old and buried stir inside her chest. Not fear, but the ghost of a girl who used to stand in front of council halls and never once lowered her eyes. "No," she said. The word landed like a slap. Vera's mouth fell open. "Excuse me? I said no." Alara set the linens down with deliberate calm. "I made a mistake with the scent, and I'll fix it. But I won't kneel for it. Not to you, and not for something this small." "You ungrateful little." That's enough. The voice that cut through the hall wasn't Vera's, and it wasn't Callum's either. It was deeper, quieter, and carried the particular stillness of someone who had never in his life needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. Every servant in the room dropped into an immediate bow. Alara turned last, and found herself looking directly into the eyes of Alpha King Roman Ashcroft. She had heard about him for years. Ruler of the Ashcroft Dominion, the largest and most powerful territory north of the mountain line. A king who had lost his mate in a border war 4 winters ago, and had not so much as looked twice at another wolf since. A king who was visiting Draven Hall this week to finalize a trade alliance with Callum's father, an alliance that, rumor said, would decide the balance of power for the next decade. He was younger than she expected, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, dressed simply despite the gold thread at his collar that marked his rank. And his eyes, pale gold, unreadable, entirely too focused on her, made something in her chest go very still. "My apologies, Your Grace," Vera said quickly, dropping into a low curtsy. The servant was being disciplined for. "I didn't ask you," Roman said, without looking at her. His gaze hadn't moved from Alara. "I asked her." Alara's pulse stumbled. No one addressed a servant directly in front of nobility. "It simply wasn't done. She was correcting a mistake with the linens," Alara said carefully, choosing her words the way she used to choose them in council chambers that no longer existed. "I told her I would fix it. I won't apologize for refusing to kneel over Rosewater." A beat of silence. Then, impossibly, the corner of Roman Ashcroft's mouth twitched. "Say that again," he said quietly. "Which part?" "All of it. I want to hear it twice before I decide whether to believe a servant just told a noblewoman no in the middle of Draven Hall." Somewhere behind her, Vera made a sound like a kettle about to boil over. Alara ignored her. "I refuse to kneel over Rosewater," Alara repeated, steady, chin lifted. "If that offends someone, they're welcome to be offended. It doesn't make me wrong." For a long moment, Roman simply looked at her. Not the way men usually looked at pretty servant girls. Appraising, dismissive, already moving past her in their minds. He looked at her the way someone looks at a puzzle piece that doesn't belong in the box it was found in. "Interesting," he murmured, almost to himself. Then, louder, to the room. "Get back to work! All of you!" The hall exploded into motion, relief and gossip rippling through the servants in equal measure. Vera shot Alara a look of pure venom before stalking away, already composing whatever version of this story she'd feed to Callum by nightfall. Roman didn't leave immediately. "What's your name?" he asked, low enough that only she could hear. "Alara Winters. Your Grace." Something flickered behind his eyes, too fast for her to name, gone before she could study it. "Winters," he repeated, like he was testing the shape of a lie. He didn't say anything else. He simply turned and walked away, and Alara stood there with her heart hammering, for reasons she refused to examine, telling herself it meant nothing. She had no way of knowing that Roman Ashcroft had spent the last 6 years of his life searching for a scent he'd only smelled once. On a burned battlefield, on a dying queen's letter, on a promise he'd made before his own mate's grave that he would find the lost heir of Emberwood, no matter what it cost him. She had no way of knowing he'd just found her. That night, lying awake in the narrow servant's bed she'd slept in for 3 years, Alara replayed the encounter more times than she cared to admit. There had been something in the way the Alpha King looked at her, not the dismissive glance nobility usually spared for servants, and not the leering appraisal she'd learned to brace against from visiting warriors either. He had looked at her like she was a puzzle worth solving, like her defiance had told him something important instead of something to be punished. She told herself it didn't matter. In 4 days, the trade delegation would leave, and Alpha King Roman Ashcroft would become nothing more than a strange, unsettling memory. A king who'd looked at her too closely, for reasons that surely had nothing to do with her. She fell asleep still thinking about pale gold eyes, and woke the next morning telling herself, once again, that it meant nothing. It would take her 3 more weeks to realize how wrong she was. Roman didn't leave Draven territory the next morning as planned. He told Callum's father it was a matter of trade terms that needed further review. In truth, he spent 3 additional days finding reasons to walk past the servants' hall, to linger in corridors Alara was known to clean, to watch her from a distance with the focused patience of a wolf who had learned, the hard way, not to trust his instincts without proof, because his instincts were screaming. Her scent, beneath the lavender soap and years of hard living, carried a thread of something achingly familiar: moonflower and cedar smoke, the scent of House Emberwood, a bloodline he had studied obsessively since the night everything burned. He had been 23 when the massacre happened. Emberwood had been an ally kingdom, ruled by Queen Isolde, a woman his own mother had trusted like a sister. When rival forces slaughtered the royal line in a single coordinated night, Roman's pack had arrived too late to stop it, but not too late to find Isolde, dying, in the ruins of her own throne room. She had grabbed his wrist with the last of her strength and made him swear an oath that had shaped every year since. Find her. My daughter lives. Find Alara and protect her, even if it costs you everything. He had searched for 6 years. Every lead had gone cold. Every rumor had been a dead end. He had almost accepted that Isolde's dying words had been the delusion of a mother who couldn't bear to believe her child was truly gone. And now a servant girl with cedar and moonflower skin was telling noble women no in the middle of a rival pack's dining hall. He needed to be certain before he did anything reckless, so he watched. He watched her work twice as hard as any other servant and never once complain. He watched her flinch, almost imperceptibly, every time Callum Draven's name was mentioned. He watched her stare at the training grounds during her rare breaks, with an expression far too knowledgeable for a girl who claimed to have grown up scrubbing floors. The expression of someone who had once studied battle formations from a war room window. And he watched, on the 4th night, as she slipped away from the servants' quarters after dark and made her way to the edge of the eastern gardens, alone. He followed at a distance that wouldn't alert her, staying downwind, silent as breath. She stopped beneath an old blackthorn tree at the garden's edge, sat down on the grass with her knees pulled to her chest and, for the first time since he'd started watching her, let her shoulders shake with silent tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, to no one, to the moon, to a mother who could no longer hear her. "I'm sorry I hid. I'm sorry I let them think I was nothing. I did it for him. I did it so he'd be safe, so we could have something real once it was over. I just need it to be worth it. Please let it be worth it." Roman's chest tightened in a way he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 4 years. He didn't reveal himself that night. He simply watched her cry beneath a tree that had no idea it was shading a lost queen, and he made a decision that would change the course of 3 territories. He would not tell her who he suspected she was. Not yet. Not until he understood exactly what and who she was protecting, and what it might cost her if the wrong wolves learned the truth before she was ready. But he would not leave Draven Hall again without her. The trade negotiations, which should have concluded in 3 days, stretched into 3 weeks. Roman found reason after reason to extend his stay. A border dispute requiring clarification, a treaty clause needing revision, a hunting alliance that required careful discussion. Callum's father was delighted. An extended visit from the most powerful Alpha King in the north was nothing but good fortune for Draven's political standing. Callum himself barely noticed. He was consumed with preparations for his own ascension. The ceremony that would formally name him full alpha of Draven Pack was 2 weeks away, and his mating ceremony to Alara, long promised and long delayed, was set to follow immediately after, a political necessity meant to cement his rule with a loyal, humble match that the pack elders had come to see as proof of his good character. Alara had once believed that ceremony would be the happiest day of her life. Lately, she wasn't sure what she believed, because in the same weeks that Roman Ashcroft extended his stay, she began noticing something else entirely: the way Callum's eyes lingered too long on Vera Sinclair during council dinners. The way his laughter, once warm and easy with her, had become distracted, distant, performed for an audience rather than felt. She told herself it was stress, pre-ceremony nerves, the weight of a title he'd waited his whole life to claim. She told herself a lot of things that spring. Meanwhile, in the quiet moments between his manufactured diplomatic obligations, Roman found ways to simply exist near her, never obvious enough to draw suspicion, never careless enough to break her cover, but present. He asked servants offhand questions about the Winters girl's history and got only fragments. She'd arrived alone 3 years ago, spoke like someone educated, kept entirely to herself outside of her duties. One evening, he found her alone in the pack library, dusting shelves she had clearly already dusted, tracing the spine of a worn history text with an expression of quiet, aching familiarity. "You read?" he asked, stepping inside. She startled, nearly dropping the cloth in her hands, then caught herself and dipped into the shallow bow expected of servants. "Your Grace, I didn't hear you. You didn't answer the question." A pause. Then, carefully, "Servants aren't usually taught." "That's not what I asked either." Her eyes met his, sharp, guarded, and for just a moment, unmistakably intelligent, in a way that had nothing to do with servitude. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "I read. My mother taught me, before she died." "What was her name?" Something in her expression shuddered instantly, a door slamming closed. "It doesn't matter now." "It might," Roman said, watching her carefully. "Names have a way of mattering more than we expect." She didn't answer that. She excused herself a moment later, and Roman let her go, filing away the flash of grief he'd seen cross her face. The grief of someone mourning a mother whose name still held power, still held danger, still held enough weight that speaking it out loud felt like an act of war. He was more certain than ever. That evening, alone in the guest quarters Draven Hall had reluctantly furnished for a king who had overstayed his welcome by 3 weeks, Roman unrolled the old letter he had carried with him for 6 years, the last correspondence Queen Isolde had ever sent his father, written months before the massacre, warm and unguarded in a way official letters rarely were. He had read it more times than he could count, searching for anything he might have missed. "My daughter has her father's stubbornness, and my own refusal to kneel when kneeling isn't earned," Isolde had written. "I worry, some nights, that the world isn't ready for a girl who refuses to disappear quietly. I hope, when the time comes, someone recognizes that refusal as strength rather than defiance." Roman set the letter down, throat tight. He had read those words dozens of times over 6 years without truly understanding them. Now, having watched Alara refuse to kneel over rosewater in a servants' hall, having watched her carry 3 years of sacrifice without once asking anyone to acknowledge it, he understood exactly what Isolde had meant. He thought, too, about his own mate, gone 4 years now, a bond severed before it had fully taken root, grief he had folded carefully away and told himself was permanent. He had not expected, in searching for a dead queen's daughter, to feel something in his chest stir back to life. It felt disloyal, somehow, to notice the quiet, furious grace with which Alara carried her burdens. It felt, more than that, inevitable, as if some part of him had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this kind of quiet, unbreakable strength. He folded the letter away and reminded himself, firmly, that his priority was her safety, not his own loneliness. Whatever he felt watching her would have to wait until she was safe enough to feel anything at all in return. He just needed her to trust him before the truth destroyed the fragile peace she'd built around herself. And he was running out of time. Because 2 weeks from now, she was going to bond herself, permanently, to a man Roman was beginning to suspect did not deserve her at all. 6 days before the mating ceremony, Alara went looking for Callum with good news for once. The seamstress had finished her ceremonial dress early, and she wanted, just once, to see something in his eyes that looked like the boy from the riverbank, instead of the exhausted stranger he'd become. She found his study empty. A servant mentioned, without much thought, that Beta Draven had gone to the West Tower with Miss Sinclair to review ceremony logistics. Alara believed it because she had spent 3 years training herself to believe good things about him, even when the evidence quietly piled up otherwise. The West Tower was mostly unused, old guest quarters, rarely visited, private. She told herself there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for why ceremony planning required privacy. She told herself that right up until she reached the door, heard Vera's laugh, low, intimate, nothing like the sharp cruelty Alara knew from her, and pushed it open. Callum was standing far too close to Vera Sinclair, his hand at her waist, her fingers curled into the front of his shirt. They broke apart at the sound of the door, but not fast enough. Not nearly fast enough. "Alara?" Callum's voice cracked with panic. "This isn't—" "Don't." The word came out steadier than she felt. "Don't you dare tell me this isn't what it looks like." Vera, to her credit, didn't bother pretending. She simply stepped back, arms crossed, something almost triumphant in her expression. "He was going to tell you eventually," she said. "After the ceremony. Once the alliance was secured, and it didn't matter what you thought anymore." The room tilted. "What alliance?" Alara said quietly. It wasn't really a question. She already knew. Callum ran a hand through his hair, and for the first time in 3 years, Alara saw him without the mask he wore for pack politics. Saw the calculation underneath. The tired, ambitious stranger who had replaced the boy who once promised her a future. "You've given me everything I have," he said, and it might have sounded like gratitude if his eyes hadn't kept flicking to Vera. The alliances, the political cover, the reputation as a humble, loyal alpha who chose a servant over status. "It's worked, Alara. It's worked perfect, but the pack elders have started asking why a future alpha's mate has no family, no lineage, no history beyond 3 years ago. It's becoming a liability." "A liability," she repeated, numb. "Vera's family controls trade routes I need," Callum continued. And it was worse. So much worse. Hearing him explain it like a political calculation instead of an apology. "Marrying you was supposed to prove I didn't need political marriages to rise. Marrying her is what actually secures the throne long term. I was going to find a way to end things quietly. After the ceremony gave us enough time to—" "Say it," Alara cut in, voice shaking now. 3 years of buried grief finally breaking the surface all at once. "Say what you actually mean. You used me. You used everything I sacrificed, everything I gave up, and you were planning to throw me away the moment I stopped being useful." "That's not—" "I gave up my name, Callum." Her voice cracked wide open. "Do you understand what that cost me? I buried who I was so completely that some mornings I forget the sound of my own mother's voice. I did that for you, for us, and you're telling me it was a political strategy?" Callum had no answer for that. Vera did. "You should be thanking us, honestly," Vera added, examining her nails as if the entire conversation bored her. "You've spent 3 years pretending to be content with servants' quarters and second-hand dresses. Did you truly believe that was a life you'd want forever? Callum is doing you a favor, ending it before you wasted your whole youth on a man who was always going to outgrow you." "Outgrow me?" Alara's laugh came out sharp and disbelieving. "Is that what you call it? I helped write the letters that turned 3 skeptical betas into his strongest allies. I sat awake for nights bribing couriers with the last jewelry I owned, so his name would reach the right ears before his rivals. I built the foundation he's standing on, and you call that outgrowing me?" Callum flinched, and for one brief moment something like shame flickered across his face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, buried beneath the same practiced composure he'd been perfecting since the day Alara first taught him how a room of nobles wanted to be spoken to. "I never asked you to do any of that," he said quietly. "No?" Alara agreed, voice trembling now with something colder than sadness. "You never asked. You simply let me. You let me disappear a little more every year, and you told yourself it was fine, because I never complained. Because I loved you too much to make it difficult for you." "Alara, don't," she said again, and this time the word carried enough finality that even Vera didn't dare fill the silence that followed. "Maybe," Vera said, almost gently, almost cruelly, You should have picked a better man to sacrifice everything for. Alara didn't remember leaving the tower. She remembered the hallway blurring past her, remembered a servant asking if she was all right and receiving no answer, remembered reaching her small room in the servants' quarters and sitting on the edge of her narrow bed, completely, utterly hollow. 3 years. 3 years of scrubbed floors and swallowed insults and midnight tears beneath a blackthorn tree, all of it in service of a future that had just revealed itself to be a lie she'd told herself. She did not cry that night. Something colder had taken the place of grief, something that felt, distantly, like the girl she used to be before the fire took her kingdom, a girl who did not kneel, a girl who did not disappear quietly. The mating ceremony was in 6 days. She was going to attend it after all. But not as anyone's quiet, humble, grateful bride. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you sacrificed everything for, you already know exactly what she's feeling right now. And trust me, what happens at that ceremony is worth every second of the wait. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it, and let me know in the comments. Would you have confronted them or walked away in silence? Word traveled through Draven Hall the way it always did, quietly, then all at once. By the 3rd day, half the servants knew something had shifted between Alara and the future Alpha, though none knew exactly what. Vera made certain the official version painted Alara as ungrateful, unstable, unfit for a title she'd never truly earned. Callum said nothing to correct it. Silence, Alara realized bitterly, had become his favorite form of cowardice. Roman heard the rumors too. He heard them within hours, in fact, because he had made it his business to know everything happening within Draven Hall's walls since the night beneath the blackthorn tree. He found her exactly once during those 6 days, in the garden again, this time not crying, but standing very still, staring at nothing, her expression unreadable in a way that worried him more than tears would have. "I know what happened," he said quietly, keeping his distance, giving her the space she hadn't asked for, but clearly needed. "Everyone knows what happened," she said flatly. "It's the only interesting gossip Draven Hall has had in months. I'm not asking as gossip," he paused. "I'm asking because I don't think you should go through with the ceremony." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "I'm not going through with it as his bride, Your Grace. I'm going through with it because I have 3 years of dignity I intend to take back in front of every witness who watched me lose it." Roman studied her, the set of her jaw, the fire returning to eyes that had looked hollow for days, and felt something settle in his chest. Not surprise, recognition. "That," he said slowly, "sounds like something a queen would do." Alara's head snapped toward him, something sharp and startled crossing her face before she buried it. "That's an odd thing to say to a servant." "Maybe," Roman said, "or maybe I've had a growing suspicion for weeks that you're not the servant you've been pretending to be." For one unguarded second, panic flashed across her features. Pure, unfiltered fear, the fear of someone whose entire survival had depended on a secret staying buried. Then it vanished, replaced by careful blankness. "I don't know what you mean. I think you do." Roman took one careful step closer. "I think your mother's name was Isolde. I think you were taught battle strategy before you were taught to sweep floors. And I think you've spent 3 years protecting a man who never once deserved the sacrifice." Alara's breath caught audibly. "How? I made a promise to a dying queen 6 years ago," Roman said, voice low, steady, the closest thing to gentle she'd ever heard from him. "I've spent every year since trying to keep it. I am not here to expose you, Alara. I am here because I think it's time someone finally protected you, instead of the other way around." She stared at him, and for the first time in 3 years, someone was looking at her, truly looking, and seeing exactly who she was, without flinching, without demanding she hide it. "The ceremony is in 3 days," she whispered. "I know," Roman said. "Let it happen. Let them all watch you take your dignity back exactly the way you planned. And then let the rest of them find out precisely who they've spent 3 years underestimating." For the first time since the West Tower, Alara felt something that wasn't grief. It felt, terrifyingly, like hope. The night of the ceremony arrived beneath a sky heavy with stars, the ceremonial grounds packed with pack members, allied delegations, and, thanks to the ongoing trade negotiations, nearly every visiting dignitary from 3 territories, including Alpha King Roman Ashcroft himself, seated in the place of honor beside Draven's Alpha elders. Alara wore the ceremonial dress the seamstress had finished early. Pale silver, simple, nothing like the elaborate gowns nobility usually wore. Because a humble servant bride wasn't supposed to outshine her future alpha, she'd once thought the plainness was a kind of romance. Tonight, walking toward the ceremony platform with her spine straight and her chin lifted, she understood it for what it truly was. One more way she'd been made small so someone else could look large beside her. Callum stood waiting at the platform's center, resplendent in ceremonial gold. Vera Sinclair seated in the front row, wearing an expression of poorly concealed satisfaction. The elder began the traditional words, the same words spoken at every mating ceremony for 100 generations. Binding words meant to seal a lifetime bond before the pack and the moon above. Callum Draven, do you accept this bond, before your pack and your ancestors? I do, Callum said, and his voice didn't even shake. The elder turned to Alara. Alara Winters, do you accept this bond, before? No. The word rang out across the ceremonial grounds like a struck bell. Silence detonated through the crowd. Somewhere behind her, Vera's smug expression cracked into open shock. Callum's face went the color of ash. Alara, he started. I said no. She turned to face the gathered crowd. 3 years of silence finally breaking wide open. And for the first time since the fire that took her kingdom, she let herself speak with the full weight of who she truly was. I gave up everything for this man. My name, my history, my dignity, kneeling in servants' halls while he built a reputation on the back of a sacrifice he never once acknowledged. And 6 days ago, I found him in the arms of the woman he actually intends to marry, discussing me like a political liability to be quietly removed. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Vera shot to her feet. That's not... Sit down, Alara said, and something in her voice, cold, commanding, entirely unlike a servant girl's, made Vera obey without thinking. Alara turned back to Callum, and when she spoke again, her voice cracked with 3 years of buried grief finally finding air. I loved you. I loved the boy who promised me a future on a riverbank that no longer exists. But you let that boy become a man who uses people and calls it strategy. I will not bond myself to that. Not tonight. Not ever. She pulled the ceremonial bonding cord from her wrist and let it fall to the platform between them. I reject you, Callum Draven. Before your pack, your ancestors, and every witness in this circle. The words of rejection, ancient, binding, absolute, settled over the ceremonial grounds like a verdict. Callum staggered back as if struck, the rejection severing whatever thin thread of claim he'd held over her. For 3 long seconds, no one in the crowd moved. Then, from the seats of honor, Alpha King Roman Ashcroft rose to his feet. Every wolf in the ceremonial grounds turned as Roman Ashcroft descended the platform steps, and the crowd parted for him the way crowds always parted for a king. Instinctive, immediate, absolute. He walked past Callum without a glance, past Vera's stunned silence, until he stood directly in front of Alara, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Your Grace, Alara whispered, suddenly, achingly aware of every eye in the ceremonial grounds fixed on them both. What are you doing? Something I should have done the moment I realized who you were, Roman said, quiet enough that only she could hear, though his next words were pitched to carry across the entire gathering. If he could not see your worth, if an entire pack spent 3 years failing to see it, then let every wolf here understand exactly what they've been looking at. He turned to face the crowd, one arm extended slightly, protectively, in front of her. This is Alara, he said, voice carrying easily across the silent grounds. Daughter of Queen Isolde, of House Emberwood, heir to a throne this continent believed lost 6 years ago. The reaction was instantaneous. A wave of gasps, disbelief, servants who had mocked her for 3 years going pale with dawning horror, Callum's father half rising from his seat in shock. Vera's face drained of every trace of color. That's impossible, Callum said hoarsely. Emberwood's royal line was destroyed. Emberwood's royal line, Roman said, was hidden by a princess brave enough to disappear so her enemies couldn't finish what they started. I made a promise to her dying mother 6 years ago that I would find her and protect her, whatever it cost. I did not expect, and here his voice softened, just slightly, just for her, to find someone who no longer needed protecting. only someone who needed to be seen. He turned back to Alara, and in front of every pack leader, every dignitary, every wolf who had ever looked through her like she was furniture, Roman Ashcroft dropped to one knee. "Alara Emberwood," he said, "I am not offering you a political alliance, or a convenient match, or a title to replace the one you just walked away from. I am offering you a moon bond, freely, because I have spent 3 weeks watching you carry more strength and grace than any court I have ever known, and I do not intend to let that go unclaimed by someone who deserves it." Alara stood frozen, 3 years of buried identity and 5 minutes of public rejection, colliding with an offer so enormous she could barely process it. "You don't have to answer tonight," Roman added quietly, "for her alone. I'm not asking you to trade one arrangement for another. I'm asking because I want you. Not your bloodline, not the alliance it brings me. You." The ceremonial grounds held its breath. Alara looked down at the man kneeling before her, a king who had spent weeks watching her cry beneath a tree, and said nothing until she was ready to hear it, who had kept a promise made to her dying mother without once expecting anything in return, who had just risked his entire political alliance with Draven Pack to stand beside a rejected bride in front of every witness who mattered. "Yes," she whispered. Then, louder, steadier, with the full weight of the girl who used to command war councils before the fire took everything. "Yes, I accept the bond." The roar that went up from the crowd was deafening. Shock, disbelief, and beneath it, unmistakably, the beginning of celebration, as if some part of every wolf present understood they had just witnessed something that would be told and retold for generations. Callum said nothing. There was nothing left for him to say. He had spent 3 years building a future on the back of a woman he'd underestimated completely, and in a single ceremony, he had lost her, his political advantage, and any chance of hiding what he truly was from a pack that had trusted him. Roman rose to his feet, took Alara's hand in his, and for the first time since his own mate's death 4 years ago, something in his chest that had been frozen solid began, slowly, to thaw. "Come," he said softly. "Let's go somewhere they can't watch us anymore. I told you this story only gets bigger, but we're not done yet." Alara's identity is out now, which means the wolves who destroyed her kingdom 6 years ago are about to find out she's still alive. If you want to see how this ends, make sure you're subscribed, because the next chapter brings her brothers back into the story, and nothing about this fight is over. They walked in silence through the emptying grounds until the noise of the ceremony faded behind them, until the only sound left was the wind moving through the pines and the quiet rhythm of 2 people who had just upended an entire political order in a single evening. Roman led her to a private courtyard overlooking the northern cliffs, far from the celebration still buzzing through the halls behind them. He didn't say anything at first. He simply stood beside her at the railing, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers, and let the night settle around them. "I have questions," Alara finally admitted. "So many questions. About my mother, about the promise you made her, about what happens now that everyone knows who I am." "Ask me anything," Roman said. "I've kept this secret for 6 years. I don't intend to keep anything else from you." So she asked. She asked what her mother had looked like in her final moments, and Roman answered honestly, gently, describing a queen who had fought until the very end, who had spoken of her children with a fierceness that had haunted him for years afterward. She asked why he had never married in the 6 years since, and he told her, quietly, painfully, about a mate lost to a border skirmish 4 winters ago, a bond severed before it ever had the chance to fully form, and the promise to Isolde that had become, somewhere along the way, the only purpose he'd allowed himself to hold on to. "I stopped believing I'd ever want a bond again," he admitted, staring out at the dark tree line beyond the cliffs. "I told myself the search for Emberwood's heir was duty, nothing more. It was easier than admitting I still wanted something for myself." "And now?" Alara asked softly. Roman turned to face her fully, and in the moonlight, the careful composure he wore like armor in every council chamber and battlefield fell away entirely. "Now I think I spent 6 years searching for a promise and found someone I'd choose even if the promise had never existed." Alara's breath caught. "That's a dangerous thing to say to someone you've known for 3 weeks." "Is it dangerous?" Roman asked. "Or is it simply true?" She didn't have an answer for that. Not one made of words. Instead, She closed the small distance between them and kissed him, tentative at first, then deepening, as 3 years of buried loneliness and 3 weeks of careful, quiet devotion collided into something neither of them had words for yet. When they finally parted, Roman rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing unsteadily. "I meant what I said at the ceremony," he murmured. "I'm not asking for a political match. I want to build something real with you, Alara. Slowly, if that's what you need. I've waited 6 years already. I can wait as long as it takes for you to trust that I mean it." "I don't think I need to wait," Alara whispered. "I think I've spent 3 years starving for exactly this, and I'm done pretending I haven't." The weeks that followed became, unexpectedly, some of the gentlest of Ilara's life. Roman insisted she take time to simply exist, to walk the gardens without servants' duties waiting at the end of them, to read from his private library without fear of being caught, to relearn, slowly, what it meant to be cared for instead of simply useful. He asked about her mother's teachings, her childhood, the parts of herself she'd buried so deeply during her years at Draven Hall that she'd nearly forgotten they existed. He listened the way no one had listened to her in 6 years, not to extract something useful, but simply because he wanted to know her. It was in one of those quiet evenings, reading together in companionable silence by the library fire, that the first messenger arrived from the eastern border with news that would end the gentleness, at least for a while. Ilara's brothers had been found, and they were already on their way. News of the ceremony spread faster than any pack messenger could carry it, faster than the moon completed its cycle. Within a week, every territory north of the mountain line knew that the lost heir of House Emberwood was alive, that she had rejected a Draven Alpha before an assembled council, and that Alpha King Roman Ashcroft himself had claimed her as his mate. It reached the ears of 4 wolves who had spent 6 years believing their sister was dead. Alara was seated in the private gardens of Ashcroft's northern estate, a place Roman had insisted she rest in while the political fallout of the ceremony settled, though resting had mostly meant staring at the horizon and trying to comprehend that her secret, kept for 3 exhausting years, no longer existed, when a servant announced, breathless, that 4 alphas had arrived unannounced at the gate, demanding entry, refusing to state their business to anyone but the Alpha King himself. Roman found her before the servant finished the sentence, already moving toward the gate with the coiled tension of a man expecting a threat. But Alara was faster, because the moment the gate opened and she saw the 4 men standing there, older, harder, scarred in ways they hadn't been 6 years ago, but unmistakably, achingly familiar, her knees nearly gave out beneath her. "Corin," she breathed, her eldest brother, who used to sneak her sweets from the kitchens when their mother wasn't looking. Theo, Bastian, Ren. For one suspended second, none of them moved, as if afraid the vision in front of them would shatter if approached too quickly. Then Corin crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and pulled her into an embrace so fierce it stole the air from her lungs. "We thought you were dead," he said, voice breaking. 6 years. 6 years, Alara, and we thought— "I couldn't risk it," she said, tears finally falling, after 3 years of holding them back. "If anyone knew even one of us survived, they would have hunted the rest of you to finish what they started. I disappeared so you'd have a chance to stay hidden." Theo, the second eldest, pulled back to study her, disbelief and fury warring across his features. "You've been alive this whole time." "Working as a servant, while we tore apart 3 territories searching for any sign of you. I know. You could have sent word, to any of us." "I know," Alara said again, quieter this time. "I was protecting you. I told myself it was the right choice." Bastian, the youngest, still barely into adulthood when the fire took their kingdom, hovered at the edge of the group with an expression Alara couldn't quite name, grief and relief, and something rawer underneath. "Was it worth it?" he asked quietly. 3 years of hiding? For a man who apparently discarded you the moment it was convenient? Alara didn't have an answer for that, not one that didn't hurt to speak aloud. Roman stepped forward then, placing a steady hand at the small of her back, and answered for her. "Whatever pain those 3 years cost her, she is not carrying them alone anymore. I intend to make certain of that." Corin studied Roman with the sharp assessment of a wolf who had spent 6 years learning not to trust easily. "You're the one who claimed her at the ceremony, publicly, against a Draven alliance that likely cost you significant political standing. I made a promise to your mother before she died, Roman said simply. I did not expect to fall in love keeping it, but I have, and I intend to protect Alara, and by extension, the four of you, with everything my territory commands. Ren, who had said nothing since the gate opened, finally stepped forward and pulled Alara into a second, gentler embrace. We're not here to take you away from a life you've chosen, he murmured. We're here because the wolves responsible for what happened to our kingdom are still out there, Alara, and now that everyone knows you're alive, they'll come looking. We came to make sure you're not facing that alone. Alara closed her eyes, surrounded by 4 brothers she'd sacrificed 3 years without, standing beside a king who had kept a dying promise she never knew existed, and felt something inside her chest that had been braced for impact since the night of the fire finally, cautiously, begin to loosen. She was not alone anymore. That evening, for the first time in 6 years, all 5 of them sat around a single table, Roman graciously excusing himself early, sensing the siblings needed the space to themselves. Corin told her, haltingly at first and then with growing warmth, about the small hidden territory they'd been surviving in, disguised as minor traders, always moving, never settling long enough to be found. Theo admitted, quietly, that he'd kept a strip of her old riding cloak in his pack for 6 years, unable to let go of the last physical piece of her he had. Bastian, who'd been too young when the fire happened to remember much of their mother's voice, asked Alara question after question, hungry for any detail she could offer him. She used to hum while she worked, Alara told him, watching his face light with quiet wonder. An old lullaby, something about the moon watching over wandering wolves. I hummed it to myself more nights than I can count, these past 3 years. It was the only piece of her I let myself keep close. Sing it, Bastian said. Please. So she did, quiet and imperfect. And for a moment, the dining hall of Roman's northern estate felt less like a war council waiting to happen, and more like the home she'd lost 6 years ago, rebuilt in miniature, around a wooden table, and 4 brothers who had never, not once, stopped looking for her. It was Ren who finally broke the fragile peace, gently, the way he'd always been the one to say the hard things no one else wanted to. We have to talk about what comes next, he said. The Hollow Accord will hear about tonight within days. They'll know you're alive, that you have allies, that the political ground beneath them just shifted. We need a plan before they do. Alara nodded, the warmth of the evening settling into something steadier, more determined. Then let's make one. Together, this time. No more disappearing to protect the people I love. We face whatever comes next as a family. Her brothers, one by one, nodded their agreement. And something in Alara's chest, braced for impact since the night their kingdom burned, finally understood that she would never again have to carry that weight entirely alone. But her brothers were right about one thing. The wolves who had destroyed House Emberwood 6 years ago had gone quiet. Not gone. And the moment her identity became public knowledge, quiet stopped being an option. The wolves who orchestrated House Emberwood's destruction 6 years ago called themselves the Hollow Accord, a coalition of minor alphas who had united under a single, brutal ambition: carve up Emberwood's fertile territories among themselves once the royal line was extinguished. For 6 years, they had ruled those stolen lands quietly, careful never to draw the attention of larger powers like the Ashcroft Dominion. Alara's survival ended that quiet. Within a month of the ceremony, reports began arriving at Ashcroft's northern estate. Hollow Accord scouts spotted near the border, increased patrols along territories that hadn't seen unusual activity in years, and, most alarmingly, a formal alliance quietly being negotiated between the Hollow Accord and Callum Draven, who had spent the weeks since his public humiliation nursing a grudge that had curdled into something far more dangerous than heartbreak. He's offering them information, Corin reported grimly, spreading a territory map across the war table in Roman's council chamber. Troop positions, alliance weaknesses, anything that helps them move against Alara before she can consolidate support from other packs. He wants revenge, Alara said quietly. Not for the kingdom. For being humiliated in front of people whose respect mattered more to him than I ever did. Roman's jaw tightened. Then we make certain his revenge costs him everything he has left. The weeks that followed blurred into a different kind of transformation than Alara had experienced in the servants' halls of Draven Pack. She was not merely reclaiming a name anymore. She was learning, alongside her brothers, alongside a king who treated her like a strategic equal rather than a fragile prize to be protected from decision-making, how to rebuild a kingdom from the ashes of 6 years of hiding. She sat in war councils. She drafted alliance proposals in her own hand, her education in diplomacy, the same education that had once felt like a burden, a reminder of a life stolen from her. Finally, fiercely useful again. She met with allied packs personally, and something in the sight of Queen Isolde's daughter standing tall, flanked by 4 alpha brothers and an alpha king who deferred to her judgment as often as he offered his own, began shifting the political tide across 3 territories. The Hollow Accord, sensing their advantage slipping, moved faster than expected. The attack came at dawn, 3 weeks after the ceremony, a coordinated strike against Ashcroft's eastern border, meant to draw Roman's forces away from the estate long enough for a second force, guided by Callum's intelligence, to strike directly at Alara. They hadn't accounted for Bastion's scouts catching the movement 2 days early. "They're splitting their forces," Bastion reported, breathless from the run back to the estate. "Main force at the eastern border as a decoy. Second force headed straight here, moving through the old forest paths Callum would have known from trade negotiations." Roman's expression went hard and cold, in a way Alara had only glimpsed once before. The night beneath the blackthorn tree, before he'd revealed himself, when he'd spoken of a promise made over a dying queen's body. "Then we don't fall for the decoy," he said. "Corin, Theo, take half our warriors to reinforce the eastern border, enough to hold the line without exposing weakness. Bastion, Ren, you're with me. We intercept the second force before it reaches the estate." "I'm coming too," Alara said. Every head in the room turned toward her. "Alara," Roman started. "This is my kingdom they destroyed," she said, steady, unmovable. "My mother they murdered. My 3 years of hiding that finally ended because I chose to stand in front of a ceremony and refused to disappear anymore. I am not going to sit in a garden while everyone I love fights a war that started with my family." Roman studied her for a long moment, and then, instead of arguing, he nodded once. "Then you fight beside me, not behind me." It was, Alara would later realize, the exact moment she stopped grieving the princess she'd buried 3 years ago, and started becoming the queen her mother had always known she could be. The battle in the old forest paths lasted less than an hour, but it was the longest hour of Alara's life. The second force, expecting an unprotected estate and a fragile, hidden princess, instead found themselves facing an alpha king, 3 Emberwood alphas, and a woman who fought with the ferocity of someone who had spent 6 years being underestimated and had absolutely nothing left to lose. When it ended, the Hollow Accord's second force lay defeated, their leader captured, and word of the failed ambush spreading through allied territories even faster than news of the ceremony had. Callum Draven's involvement did not stay hidden for long. Within days, the Draven elders, furious at being dragged into a war through their future alpha's petty revenge, stripped him of his title before it had even fully been granted, exiling him from the pack that had once celebrated his rise. Vera Sinclair left with him. Neither of them, Alara noted with something that felt distantly like closure rather than satisfaction, ever contacted Draven territory again. That night, once the wounded had been tended and the captured Hollow Accord commander secured for questioning, Alara found Roman alone on the training grounds, still in his battle-worn clothes, staring out at the tree line where the fighting had ended hours earlier. "You should be resting," she said, settling beside him on the low stone wall. "So should you." He glanced at her, taking in the dried mud on her boots, the shallow scratch along her forearm she hadn't bothered to mention to anyone. "You fought well today. I had good teachers," she said. "My mother, before everything. My brothers, growing up. You, apparently, though you'll never admit you were showing off out there." A rare, genuine laugh escaped him, the kind she'd only heard a handful of times since the ceremony. "I wasn't showing off. You absolutely were." "Perhaps a little," he admitted, and the easy warmth in his voice settled something in her chest that had been tight with adrenaline for hours. He reached over, gently turning her arm to examine the scratch. "This needs attention. It's nothing." It's not nothing to me. His thumb traced carefully along the edge of the wound, and the tenderness in the gesture, after a day of violence and fear, undid her more completely than any battle had. I told your brother I'd let you fight beside me, not behind me. I didn't say it wouldn't terrify me every second of it. You didn't have to let me at all, Alara said quietly. Most alphas wouldn't have. Most alphas haven't spent 6 years learning that the wolves who survive the longest are the ones no one bothered underestimating twice. Roman met her eyes, something raw and unguarded in his expression that he rarely allowed anyone to see. I am not interested in a mate I have to protect from her own strength, Alara. I fell for the version of you that refused to kneel in a servant's hall. I have no intention of asking her to become smaller, now that I know what she's capable of. Alara leaned into him, exhaustion and relief, and something warmer than either finally catching up with her all at once. My mother used to say, a kingdom is only as strong as the two people standing at its center. I used to think she meant a king and queen ruling separately, side by side out of duty. And now I think she meant this, Alara said softly. Two people who trust each other enough to actually stand together. Not performing strength for a crowd. Just this. Roman pressed a kiss to her temple, the battlefield quiet settling around them like a held breath finally released. Then we'll build it exactly like that, he murmured. Together or not at all. This is what happens when you underestimate a woman who spent years being told she's nothing. And we're almost at the ending you've been waiting for. If this story has had you hooked, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep making stories like this one. So if you haven't yet, now's the moment. One more chapter to go. With the Hollow Accord's ambush broken, and Callum's betrayal exposed to every territory watching, the political tide that had been slowly shifting in Alara's favor became a flood. Allied pacts who had hesitated to formally recognize a princess, believed dead for 6 years, now sent envoys, eager to align themselves with the resurgent House Emberwood before their rivals could. The Hollow Accord itself, having lost its strongest political leverage and half its remaining warriors in the failed strike, began fracturing from within, minor alphas turning on each other, each one scrambling to negotiate favorable terms with Emberwood before the entire coalition collapsed. Alara stood at the center of it, and for the first time in 6 years, she did not feel like she was hiding from her own history. She felt like she was finally standing inside it. The formal council that would decide the fate of Emberwood's stolen territories convened 1 month after the failed ambush, in a great hall packed with alphas from a dozen territories, the same kind of gathering that had once terrified a 19-year-old girl watching her mother's kingdom burn. This time, Alara walked into that hall not as a hidden princess or a rejected servant bride, but as the acknowledged heir of House Emberwood, flanked by 4 brothers who had spent 6 years refusing to give up on her, and beside a king who had kept a promise to a dying queen with a devotion that had, somewhere along the way, become love. 6 years ago, Alara said, her voice carrying across the packed hall with none of the fear that had once defined her hiding. My mother was murdered, my kingdom was stolen, and I disappeared so completely that even I sometimes forgot who I used to be. I spent 3 of those years believing that disappearing was the only way to keep the people I loved safe. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the gathered alphas, some who had once dismissed Emberwood as a fallen power not worth remembering, others who had quietly hoped for exactly this moment. I was wrong, she continued. Hiding did not keep anyone safe. It only delayed the reckoning that was always coming. Today, I am not asking for your pity, or your charity, or your patience with a broken kingdom trying to rebuild. I am asking for your alliance. Because House Emberwood is returning to these territories, whether the Hollow Accord's remnants approve or not, and I would rather rebuild alongside allies than enemies. One elderly alpha near the back of the hall, a wary, skeptical man from a border territory that had stayed carefully neutral through 6 years of shifting power, rose to voice what several others were clearly thinking. Forgive me, Your Highness, but words are easy in a hall full of allies. What assurance do we have that House Emberwood, once restored, will not simply become another power we must fear rather than trust? Alara did not flinch from the question. If anything, something in her posture settled, as if she'd been waiting for exactly this moment. You have my word, which I understand means little from a stranger. So let me offer something better. She gestured to her brothers beside her. For 6 years, these 4 men searched for a sister they had every reason to believe was dead, and never once stopped. For 3 years, I disappeared entirely rather than risk dragging allies into a war that wasn't theirs. And a year ago, I stood in front of an entire ceremony and told the truth, even when a lie would have been safer and easier. She let that settle before continuing. A kingdom does not need every leader to trust it blindly. It needs a track record of choosing truth over convenience, even when convenience would have cost less. I intend to keep choosing truth. Watch me do it, and decide for yourselves whether that assurance is enough. The elderly Alpha studied her for a long moment, then inclined his head. Not full agreement, but the beginning of it. A fair answer, he said. Better than most kingdoms offer. One by one, the assembled Alphas rose. First, the Pax who had always quietly supported Emberwood's memory. Then, gradually, the more hesitant territories who could see, clearly now, which side of history was about to win. And finally, the wary border Alpha himself, rising last, but rising all the same. By the time the council concluded, House Emberwood had been formally restored, its stolen territories returned under a treaty that would take months to fully implement, but had, in that single hall, already been decided in principle. The Hollow Accord, stripped of its strongest members and its political cover, would not survive the year as a unified coalition. Roman found Alara afterward, alone on the hall's balcony, watching the moon rise over territories that had once belonged to her mother, and would, soon, belong to her once more. Your mother would be proud, he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. I hope so, Alara said, and for the first time in 6 years, the words didn't carry the weight of grief, only quiet, hard-won peace. I spent so long thinking I had to disappear to honor what she wanted for me. I think I finally understand what she actually wanted. What's that? For me to be exactly who I am, Alara said, turning to face him fully, without apologizing for it to anyone ever again. Roman reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face, with a tenderness that still, weeks later, made her breath catch. I think, he said softly, that's the version of you I fell in love with. Not the crown, not the throne. Just you, standing in a servant's hall, telling a noblewoman no. Alara laughed, a real laugh, bright and unguarded, the kind she hadn't allowed herself in 6 long years. You're going to bring that up for the rest of our lives, aren't you? Every anniversary, Roman promised, and kissed her beneath a sky full of stars, on a balcony overlooking a kingdom that was, at long last, coming home. The full moon bond ceremony took place 3 months later, beneath the restored towers of House Emberwood, in the same ceremonial grounds where Alara's mother had once presided over a kingdom at peace. It was, in every way, the opposite of the ceremony that had almost bound her to Callum Draven. There was no plain silver dress meant to keep her small. Alara wore Emberwood's restored royal colors, deep midnight blue threaded with silver, a crown that had been recovered from the ruins of the old throne room, resting properly on her head for the first time in 6 years. There was no hollow, transactional vow recited by a man performing loyalty for political gain. There was only Roman, standing across from her with the same steady gaze he'd worn the night he first told her to say something again, and 4 brothers seated in the front row, finally, fully reunited with the sister they'd spent 6 years refusing to stop searching for. Alara Emberwood, the elder intoned. Do you accept this bond? Before your kingdom, your family, and the moon above? I do, Alara said, and this time, the words carried nothing but certainty. Roman Ashcroft, the elder continued, do you accept this bond? Before every territory now allied beneath a restored crown? I do, Roman said, and I have never meant anything more completely in my life. The bonding cord passed between them, sealing a promise that had begun not with political calculation, but with a king who kept his word to a dying queen, long after it would have been easier to let the promise fade, and a princess who had learned, through 3 years of hiding and 1 unforgettable night of refusing to disappear anymore, that her worth had never depended on anyone else's recognition of it. When the ceremony ended and the celebration began, allied packs from a dozen territories filling the restored halls of Emberwood with music and laughter that hadn't echoed there in 6 long years, Alara found a quiet moment to slip away to the garden, drawn, as she always was, to a blackthorn tree not unlike the one where Roman had first realized exactly who she was. He found her there minutes later, as she'd known he would. "Second thoughts?" he asked softly, settling beside her on the grass. "Never," Alara said, leaning into him. "I was just thinking about the girl who used to cry under a tree just like this one, convinced her sacrifices didn't matter to anyone. What would you tell her, if you could?" Alara considered the question, watching the moon climb higher over a kingdom finally fully restored. "I'd tell her that hiding never made her small," she said quietly. "It just meant no one had found her yet, and that the right person, when he finally did find her, was never going to need her to be anything other than exactly who she already was." Roman pressed a kiss to her temple, and beneath the same eternal moon that had witnessed a fallen kingdom, a broken engagement, a public rejection, and a promise kept across 6 impossible years, Alara Emberwood finally, completely, stopped waiting to become someone worth loving. She already was. She always had been. The moon simply needed the rest of the world to catch up. Snow had just begun to melt across the northern territories when Alara stood once more on the balcony, overlooking Emberwood's restored towers, this time with a very different kind of anticipation humming beneath her skin. Corin found her there, arms crossed, watching riders approach from the southern road. "You're supposed to be resting," he said, echoing words she'd once said to Roman a lifetime ago. "I've been resting for a week," Alara said dryly. "If I rest any more, I'll forget how to stand." "Mother would have said the same thing," Theo offered, joining them, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. A smile that came easier now, a full year removed from the desperate, grief-hardened man who'd shown up at Ashcroft's gates half a year into their reunion. She never did sit still, not even at the end. Bastian and Ren arrived a moment later, the 4 of them gathering around their sister the way they had every evening since the kingdom's restoration. A habit none of them had needed to discuss, simply a quiet insistence on never again letting 6 years of silence come between them. "The southern envoys will be here within the hour," Ren reported. "The Hollow Accord's last holdout formally surrendered its claim to the eastern valleys this morning. It's over, Ilara, all of it. Every territory our mother once ruled is back under Emberwood's banner." Ilara let that settle over her. 6 years of grief, 3 years of hiding, 1 impossible ceremony, and 12 months of rebuilding, finally arriving at a peace she'd genuinely stopped believing she'd live to see. "She'd be proud of all of you," Alara said quietly. "Every one of you spent 6 years refusing to give up the search. I don't think I ever properly thanked you for that. You don't need to thank family for loving you," Corin said simply, echoing, without knowing it, something Roman had told her many months before. Roman found them there as the sun began to set, crossing the balcony with the unhurried ease of a man who had long since stopped needing to guard every word and gesture around the people who mattered most to him. He pressed a kiss to Alara's temple, resting a hand lightly, protectively, over the gentle curve of her stomach, a secret the 2 of them had shared with her brothers only days before, still too new and too precious to announce beyond the family gathered on that balcony. "The envoys are asking for you both," he said. "Though I told them the future Queen of Emberwood is allowed exactly 1 evening a year to simply watch a sunset with her brothers before returning to matters of state." "1 evening," Alara agreed, smiling as Ren rolled his eyes fondly, and Bastian pretended not to be moved. "And then back to rebuilding a kingdom, together," Roman said, echoing a vow made in the aftermath of a battle nearly a year prior, a vow that had held true through every council session, every difficult negotiation, every quiet night since. "Together," Ilara agreed, and watched the sun set over a kingdom that had finally, fully, come home, carrying within her the promise of a future her mother had died believing in, and a love that had asked her, from the very first night beneath a blackthorn tree, to be nothing more than exactly who she already was. Thank you so much for staying with this story all. If Alara and Roman's story moved you the way it moved us while writing it, please take 3 seconds to hit like, drop a comment telling us your favorite moment, and if you're not already subscribed to Rena's Romance 2, now is the perfect time. We release brand new full-length werewolf romance stories every single week, and you will not want to miss what's coming next. See you in the next story.